Hi, I'm Patricia Kaufman, Executive Director of the CLL Society, here to welcome you to our virtual community meeting featuring information about COVID-19. For part 2 of this series, please register for our April the 3rd part 2 meeting. This format was designed to provide a vital link between your questions and our panel of experts. Today we have doctors Anthony Mato and Danielle Brander, CLL experts. We have a lab scientist who loves to teach, Dr. Susan LeClaire, who will answer your questions about COVID-19 testing. Some of you may have questions about the supply chain for the CLL medications that you are currently on. So we have CLL patient and pharmacist Thomas Henry, who has up-to-the-minute information on that. We have read all of the questions that have been submitted to us in advance and compiled them so that they can be succinctly answered by our panel of experts. And with the 1,100 people who are on this call right now, I can assure you that you are not alone. The CLL Society is here to help. Smart patients get smart care. Dr. Brian Kaufman will now be the moderator.
Thank you to our Executive Director and my caregiver, Patricia Kaufman. And I think because we're going to have a lot of questions, I think we'll just kind of roll through things here pretty quickly. In terms of the agenda, we're already well into the introduction part, and we're going to introduce the panelists. But before we do that, we're going to have just some quick polling questions with you. And then at the end, we're going to do some poll questions after. So you should see the polling questions right now. Please remember to scroll down. There's actually 4 polling questions. So if you could answer all 4 and scroll down through that, and we'll give you just a minute or 2 to do that so we can keep things rolling. So let's take a look here. So we have a fairly high level of people feeling comfortable, understanding the precautions they should be taking. What to do, a little less strength there in terms of what to do if they need testing. More of a spread in terms of concerns about shortage of meds. We'll be talking about that. And I think because we're going to have a lot of questions, I think we'll just kind of roll through things here pretty quickly. In terms of the agenda, we're already well into the introduction part, and we're going to introduce the panelists. Tom is our pharmacy expert, a former chief pharmacist at Moffitt and Roswell, and a CLL patient himself. Tom, do you want to start for us, please?
Sure, Brian, thank you. So I just want to start off by saying that at present, as of 20 minutes ago, I did review the most commonly prescribed drugs that are used in CLL. And at present, there are no reported shortages in the United States. And it's reassuring, speaking with Dr. Mato before we started this presentation, he has actually received several calls from companies that provide CLL drugs, and they are reassuring him and other providers that there are no current shortages, and they do not foresee any shortages coming up in the near future. As you know, China is a major supplier of medications in the United States. There have been some production interruptions in certain regions as the COVID moved along, but we're seeing drops in the number of cases in China, and there are reports that they are resuming production and some normal economy measures. As you've probably seen on the news as well, the president and the Congress are considering legislation to require more drugs to be made in the United States than has been the practice prior to the pandemic. And I think that we'll see this measure will gain some traction and supporters. I think it's also interesting to note that the CEO of FedEx has been interviewed on the television and in the media, and he has said that FedEx and other providers have dramatically increased the number of cargo flights they have all over the world. So we hear a lot about the passenger airline interruptions, but cargo is continuing to be moved. So it doesn't appear to be as big of an issue as what some had led us to believe. There are some strategies that patients can do to improve their supply. So one of those is early refills. A lot of people that don't know that your insurance will pay for a refill once you've used 75% of the doses that were prescribed. So if you have a ibrutinib, for example, and you have the 28-day supply, you can actually order that on the 21st or 22nd day and start to stockpile a little that way. If you're on the capsules of ibrutinib, you can also possibly consider, if we get into a situation where there's a shortage, that there might be a need for you to do a dose reduction, and yet you would still have the same number, or you'd have greater number of doses available. So for example, I was initially on the 420 milligram. I'm now on the 280. So with the capsules, it's really easy to do this. My only caution is that you do not do this on your own. Next slide. And then we have to think about the non-CLL drugs. So as many people are aware, there have been a number of shortages going on throughout the country. And maintenance medications are critical to our patients. Comorbidities increase the risk for patients that, may contract COVID. And so we have to make sure that, they have these medications. When patients are well controlled on these maintenance medications, they have a similar risk to the general population in many cases. And the best example of this is diabetes. So I think that patients need to be proactive and order their medications early, not necessarily what we were talking about earlier, but don't wait until you've taken your last pill to call the pharmacy, because if they are out of the medication you need, there may be a need to get a hold of your doctor for an alternate. You can request 90-day supplies if your insurance will allow it. I would consider mail order pharmacy or a pharmacy that delivers in your area as options for not having to go out. And every state, at one point I was licensed in 23 states. All of those states allow the transfer of prescriptions other than controlled substances. And it's an easy process where the new pharmacy just calls your original pharmacy and they transfer the prescription. So that's an option. And then if shortages develop, work with your medical team to find clinically appropriate alternatives. And I think the medical team is a key to the safe use of any medication. And I'll turn it over now to Dr. Susan LeClaire, who will speak about labs.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to give a little bit of basic information about some of the testing that's going on, because unfortunately a lot of the media and some other people use words interchangeably and they're not interchangeable. So this is a very brief overview. I'm used to going 50 minutes and Brian will shut me off if that's the case. But what are we testing now? We're testing now to answer the question, do you have the disease? That's what all of this testing that's going on with nasal swabs and throat swabs is going to do. I want to know, do you or do you not have the disease? And maybe to a certain extent, when we're talking about a quantitative test, at what stage of the disease process are you? How many, what is the viral load? How many of those are there? As of yesterday at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a new test was approved by the FDA that's based on antibodies. The problem with an antibody-based test is you have to have made the antibodies, and it takes you a while to make those antibodies. And there are different classes of antibodies that come on board by your immune system as we do things. Can I have the next slide, please? There you go. The thing that is happening when you drive up anywhere in the United States right now is not a test. It is a specimen collection. And it is one of the few places in this whole thing that you have some control over. You want that swab to be collected by somebody who knows exactly what they're doing, because when that swab comes to the laboratory, that's all we're going to have to see if this virus is present. So make sure that when someone is doing this, remember that these collectors have been standing there for hours in the cold or the rain. They're probably a little tired. They're probably a little worn out. So make sure, participate, that the swab doesn't touch the upper part or the insides, the sides of the nose. It has to reach all the way back. If you don't gag the way everybody on TV is gagging when you see the videos of this, then they didn't do it right. And you need to say, I don't think you did that right. Can you do it again? Because if I get a specimen and I run it, I may not have the ability to give you the answers that you need. Another thing that you can participate in is make sure your name is on the swab. I have talked to several of, well, actually many of my colleagues across the country, and they are having to throw away swabs. Everybody may now gasp, because when the swab comes to the laboratory, it has no name, or it has a name like LeClaire. There are more than one LeClaire in the city that I live in. It might even have LeClaire S, but is that Sam, Stephen, Samantha? It happens that 5 miles away from me, there is another Susan J. LeClaire. So not only do we have to have the full name, we need your birth date, and we need the name of your physician to whom we communicate this stuff. Check to find out if all of that is there. No one's going to yell at you because you want the single best usable and high quality specimen you can get. Next slide, please. Now, this is the part that many of you might just fall asleep in. So I'm going to go really, really fast. Everyone wants to know, why can't I get the test right away? It takes between 5.5 to 16 hours to get the test done, depending upon what we're doing and how many of them. You yourself know it's easier to get a lunch ready for 2 than it is dinner for 12. So the more tests that we do, the longer some of that time is going to take. Now, with the advent of the private companies and the big commercial chains coming in, more tests can be done. They can be run on more expensive and more robotic instruments so that they can get done a little bit faster. But think, if you get your swab taken at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you're probably not going to get that answer for at least a day. So you can sit home and fret, or you can just know that that's what's going to happen to that. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay. What about those antibody tests? And several of you have written in with questions about antibody tests. Here's the deal. When you look at these, it takes at least 5 days or so. Look at the green curve. It takes at least 7 days or so, sometimes as long as 10 or more, before something called IgM, your very first antibody, begins to show up. That's a defensive antibody. It is your body's first response to making this stuff. Think of a cold. When do you start feeling better? Around day 8, because you've got enough antibodies now to begin to fight against this thing. IgM disappears relatively quickly after 3 weeks, and then IgG, that's the red one, begins. We do not know as of yet if the IgG antibodies are protective or if they get smug after they get rid of the COVID virus and say, well, I don't have to do this anymore, and forget about it. The idea of an antibody test then is you had to have this somewhere around a week before we can even begin to look at the production of antibodies. Most of the time, we use antibody testing for community spread, for history, for tracking people. And so you have to see that there are 2 different tests. The antibody test is easier, of course, because life is like that. But the antigen test is what everyone is, the viral test is what everyone's going to want, because that's going to give you a diagnosis. Now, I had a couple of questions having to do with just life in general. How long does the virus last on newspapers or other surfaces? And my question back to you is, do you want to know if they're alive, if they're infectious, or if they're dead? because those are going to give you different things. I can tell you that there are studies out there that show you can find viral particles for as much as maybe 2 to 3 days on some things. But I'll tell you what I do with the newspaper and other things. I get up in the morning and I wash up, and then I read the paper. And after I read the paper is when I take my shower. And why do I do that? Because I can wash my face, I can wash my hands, and I can get rid of the newspaper. Something comes in the mail and it's wrapped in some kind of cardboard package. Leave it there for a couple hours. The viruses don't like very cold or very hot temperatures, so just let it sit for a couple of hours or so. If you're really, really concerned, spray it with disinfectant, but open up the package, get rid of the packaging, wash your hands. And that's kind of the easiest way to think about what you should do handling things that are coming into your house. There's a lot of stuff on the web right now about using various home chemicals to clean things. You can use alcohol, but you have to use alcohol that's over 62%. So unfortunately, unless you have a still in the backyard and you can control this, using booze isn't going to work. It's too low. You're going to have to use isopropyl or rubbing alcohol or something like that that has more than 62% alcohol in it. If you don't have any alcohol and you want to use bleach, on a daily basis, I can tell you, I would make up about a quart of 10% bleach. Why a quart? Because that's pretty much all you're going to use that first day or every day. And if you use the same bleach after 24 hours, it's not as active. No, you cannot use vinegar of any type. So that means you can save your balsamic for the salads and not for anything else. How do you know you have COVID-19 is a wonderful segue for me to say, not my job. I can tell you about the testing. I can tell you how sensitive they are, but the people that you now want to listen to are the physicians who treat patients. And so I will hand this off now to Dr. Anthony Matto.
Wow, that was an incredible presentation. I actually learned some things from you, so it was really helpful. Thanks so much for attending this. I'm Anthony Matto from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Not a COVID-19 expert, although becoming one, having to become one, unfortunately. I take care of patients in New York City and in New Jersey, all of whom have CLL or Richter's transformation. And so I was really happy to be invited by Brian to participate in this call, because I think in New York City, we're a bit ahead of the curve in terms of cases. And we're hearing a lot of the questions and trying to address many of the issues that you may be facing right now or may face in the future. So I didn't prepare slides because I wanted to save as much time as possible to address what are the most pressing questions to patients with CLL. And so with that being said, I will pass the baton to Dr. Brander from Duke University.
Thanks, Anthony, and of course to Brian and everyone on this call. As we hear more and more questions, it really is a honor for us to be a part of this, because we learn so much from each other and from these questions, and this really changes our practice. So I treat patients or help care for patients at Duke University, so I'm in Durham, North Carolina. And again, my clinic mostly is caring for patients either with CLL, some of them, of course, not on treatment, others on treatment or clinical trial, and I do that with the help of a whole team. So I, like Anthony, did not prepare separate slides because we plan to learn from you and talk through this together.
So let's move to, thank you very much to our faculty for a nice introduction. And now we'll get into the meat of this, which is answering people's questions. And I've tried to summarize these questions in a way. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Matto. We got a lot of questions about clinical trials. If people are in a clinical trial, will those be continued? Will they stopped? Are new trials enrolling now? What should somebody do if they're in a trial and it's on hold, or they were about to enter a trial? And let me just add this, a lot of questions about, should I keep my regular visit? If I'm scheduled to see you or Dr. Brander in the next 2 weeks and I'm doing fine, should I come to clinic? What if I'm scheduled to see my family doctor or my gynecologist or something like that? Should I keep those routine visits?
Well, I think that the clinical trials question is a very important one, and it's something that's affecting my practice and colleagues' practices right now. Clinical trials are such an important part of the care of patients with CLL. And I think the best way for me to approach the question is to delve into the way that we're handling this. So we do have many patients on clinical trials at this moment. Most of those trials are interventional. My stance has been that it is not in the best interest of patients to stop treatment for patients in the context of a clinical trial. Largely because we feel that the crisis with COVID-19 will pass, and yet the CLL will still be present following that crisis. And so it is really our duty to try to control disease as best as possible. With that being said, if anyone's participated in a clinical trial, you know that there are many, many visits associated with trials, a lot of monitoring, a lot of blood work. And many of that is important in terms of the context of learning if a drug is working or not, or drug levels are needed or not, but many of that can be omitted. And so what we've tried to do is make sure that patients are able to have access to their study drugs, that have the appropriate monitoring in the context of the studies, but to minimize the patient contact with our center to as little as possible, but yet to feel that we're treating patients in the context of a trial very safely. Outside of cycle 1, day 1, really the first contact with the clinical trial, we are largely switching to telemedicine visits, trying to do home labs, and even shipping study drugs to patients. And we're doing that on a large scale basis within our CLL program. In terms of new enrollments to clinical trials, we're trying to keep that to a minimum. But our general feeling is that if the study or the study drug is what is in the best interest of patients, meaning that the standard of care options are what we consider not as good, or there are no standard of care options available to patients, then we are keeping those clinical trials open. Because I do feel that it's important to not provide a patient what we consider an inferior approach when we have options for patients that can be done safely. So we're taking it case by case. Clinical trials are not on hold, but they're certainly being measured against the need for contact within the center. And then related to the routine care of patients, as everybody with CLL knows, there are various stages of CLL, patients who are being observed, patients who are treated and in remission, patients who are undergoing active therapy. And we're taking those situations differently, trying to minimize contact for patients who have been quite stable for a long period of time, but recognizing that during this crisis, patients may progress, and under those circumstances, we may need to see them. So we're looking at every chart individually, looking at the case, and then trying to weigh heavily whether we need to see them face-to-face versus a phone visit versus deferring the visit altogether.
Dr. Mato, a follow-up question to that that's been asked in various ways. If you're on medication, a lot of us are on oral medication or receiving monthly infusions. Should I continue those with if there's COVID in my community?
I think this is a really important question. I'm hearing this a lot from my patients. So I'll give you my take, and then I'll be curious to hear if Dr. Brander has the same or a different take on it. Right now, we don't have a lot of information to suggest that we should stop an oral or an infusional CLL-directed therapy as a preventive measure to minimizing the risk of developing COVID-19. So I'm telling my patients at this time they should continue on their standard therapies and on their clinical trials therapies, and that we don't have data to support stopping them to minimize the risk of immunosuppression, for example. It's a question that myself and Dr. Brander and others as a group are studying now. But my general response to patients is that they should stay on their standard meds. And if they're diagnosed with COVID-19, again, it's a case-by-case basis. But there are several instances where where the disease needs to be controlled, and I'm recommending to continue their standard meds, oral or infusional.
Dr. Brander, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think obviously very important points and very important questions, but it's a very similar approach that we and other colleagues are taking, which our goal here is keep our patients with CLL as much as we can, safe from COVID-19 and the complications, but also keep patients safe with their CLL, which for many of them involves the treatment. And so we're trying to do both those things, focusing on both of them at the same time and advocating for patients to do those two things as safe as possible. So how do you stay on treatment and be as safe as possible? Well, as Anthony mentioned, it really is. We're literally, and I know colleagues across the country are doing this, going over every patient scheduled for every day to figure out what the best, safest method is to follow that patient, whether they're on trial or not. So that takes a long time, and I know patients feel the stress and maybe the time it's taking us to go through and do that, but that's why it's taking so long. We want to be very careful that in keeping everyone as safe as we can from this pandemic, that we also are advocating for the treatment of their CLL to be able to continue.
Dr. Brander, let me follow up with you. I got a number of questions about a hypothetical, a possible vaccine. And I think most sophisticated CLL patients know we're not supposed to have live or attenuated vaccines. Would the coronavirus vaccine be a killed vaccine? Would it work for CLL patients? Because data suggests we may not do as well with vaccines. And a question related to that immunity is if you do get the infection and recover from it, would we be protected from getting it again as a CLL patient?
Yeah, so lots of good questions. I think very basic when we think of trying to prevent a virus or infectious disease and the prevention part, we think of vaccine. Just to clarify, a vaccine is different from an antiviral, like an antivirus medicine. And so one of the reasons it takes a long time to develop a vaccine is you have to figure out how you're going to get the body to go after something, to target it, to test it for safety, and then you're using it as a prevention. So in theory, you're trying to large scale it and give it to a large number of patients. So you need a certain period to make sure that it's safe and effective. The other part is I think sometimes think of vaccine being this one thing to target the COVID-19. But in reality, what's been going on is, as many might have heard, starting March 16th in the US, a biotech company and a vaccine institute in Washington started testing one vaccine possibility for this with participants that were 18 to 55, and they had to be healthy. But my point is, while that caught media attention, what I think people should know is that was using one strategy, something I won't go into, but called mRNA. But there are many others that are opened elsewhere, because the point is people that are working on this, the scientists, the healthcare providers, you have to think of multiple ways to maybe develop a vaccine. So I think it's a great question. The one, an mRNA, that's not injecting the virus itself, but I think the important point of the question is there's actually multiple different methods being explored. Though everyone sees on the news, well, this is going to take 12 to 18 months, that's because of all the steps. But on the front end, the positive thing I think to focus on is people were trying to prepare for this, get the information out there. And so the time from having the kind of genetic information to try to develop a vaccine was actually very short. But now it's going to just be the longer time frame. And again, vaccine different from antiviral. The question about whether CLL patients can receive it will depend on what type of vaccine was to move forward. To the question of would it be effective for patients with CLL, you'll hear, I think today we'll mention a lot about how heterogeneous patients can have in terms of their risk for infection. Have they ever had infection? Can they mount an immune response? So it's really hard to say patient by patient, but I think that there's hope with other vaccines that it will be useful, and it'll just have to depend on what vaccines carried forward.
I'm going to stay with you here, Dr. Brander, because there's a whole, and maybe Dr. Matto or anybody else wants to chip in on this, but this is sort of one of the big existential questions. As a CLL patient, are we at higher risk for getting COVID-19? And if we do get it, are we higher risk for complications?
So that is a difficult question, I think, as we're trying to see what information is coming in. Thank you for, you separated it kind of in two questions, because sometimes you hear patients with CLL are at higher risk. What does that mean? Higher risk of actually getting the virus and symptoms, or higher risk if you get the virus? There have been studies that have tried to look at places that have had a lot of the COVID-19 disease outbreak, especially China or other parts of the world, to look at patients with cancer. So the difficulty is now when you're looking at studies, it's bringing together a very diverse group of patients. Their cancer might have been in a different location. It kind of makes sense. Lung cancer patients with active treatment or recent surgeries are going to be very different maybe than patients with CLL. But the one information that I will point out is one study highlighted that the number of visits might be a common risk factor for the risk of getting the virus for patients with cancer and patients with CLL. So like Anthony mentioned, this is why we're going through and trying to minimize the visits, trying to minimize your exposure. I mean, all the kind of points that you can think about there. And then lastly, your part about would it be more severe if a patient with CLL does come down with the virus? And again, by knowing most patients, the information we have about COVID-19 disease is patients who are over age 60 or have other medical problems or very broadly immunosuppressed are at higher risk, but I think there's going to be a lot of individual variability within that.
Dr. Matto or Dr. Leclerc, Tom, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree with what Danielle said. I think when all of this is said and done, at least my general take so far on my particular patient population is I haven't seen many cases. I've definitely diagnosed this already, but I think that oftentimes CLL patients are so well educated and so compliant that just my general sense is that whatever rules have been put in place by the CDC and others have really been followed by our patient populations very strictly. Whether the risk is higher or not, I don't think we'll be able to understand that biologically at the moment, but from a compliance perspective, I feel like the risk has got to be lower based on the fact that patients are very compliant with the recommendations for social distancing and self-isolation under certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, there's a couple questions I got that I'd like you to address. One is about the ibrutinib supply chain specifically. And the second, is there a risk of getting the virus from medications that come from China? If it's shipped from China, can the medicines actually carry the virus?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, there have been, as we know, the actual manufacturer of the ibrutinib product is in China. Went to the map and looked at where that's located, and it's actually essentially across a body of water from Hong Kong. Which I think is a positive fact in that ships are still sailing, and as we mentioned earlier, aircraft are still, circling the globe with cargo. So that proximity, it's a good distance away from the Wuhan area where this outbreak occurred in some of the more affected areas in China. So we have not seen any interruptions in that. Again, as was mentioned by some of our physician panelists, and by Dr. Leclerc, the virus living on these surfaces, these compounds are sterilized in the production process. They're not handled by people, they're handled by machines. And so I would say that based on my, knowledge of manufacturing processes, the risk that anybody could get COVID from the packaging, I would again say, as Dr. LeClaire said, you get the package from the pharmacy, wipe it down with some, with an alcohol wipe or something along those lines. But that's probably your biggest risk, is the handling of that product from the pharmacy into your hands.
There's a lot of questions about IVIG, and so people are wondering about whether it's safe to continue to get their IVIG, whether they should shift to at-home subcutaneous IVIG. Should they get IVIG if they're not getting it now to protect them? If you get sick, should you get IVIG? Should you, some of the questions come from Europe where they say IVIG is being diverted away from CLL patients towards COVID patients. So maybe I can have you, Tom, start with the issue of IVIG versus subcutaneous immune globulins in getting it at home. And then maybe I can get Dr. Mado and Brand, or Dr. LeClaire, if you want to jump in on that too, about that.
Well, there are 2 formulations that are available, and there are multiple suppliers of the intravenous formula. And essentially, this subcutaneous form is typically given in the home. And so therefore you reduce the risk to the patient of having to go into an infusion center and being exposed to other patients. Whether one of those products is superior, I think I'll leave that to the clinicians. But I would say that, if you're on it, I would say continue on it and speak with your team. I think that, communication will be the key to how we deal with this entire situation. And having been in 2 major comprehensive cancer centers, I know that the team is bigger than just your doctor. You have nurses and nurse practitioners and pharmacists, and there is a big support network, and take advantage of that team.
What I would add to that is that, for most patients out there, just as a reminder, the indication for IVIG is what we call hypogammaglobulinemia, or low antibody levels in the setting of having frequent infections. And so for patients with CLL who have low antibody levels, who've had frequent infections, either sinus or pulmonary infections, for example, I am recommending that they stay on IVIG if it's already been prescribed. In terms of efficacy from subcutaneous versus the intravenous formulations, I don't think we have any data to support one approach over the other. Regarding the use of IVIG to prevent COVID infections, at this point in time, we have no data to support that practice, and no reason to believe that the current supply would even have been collected from patients who've been exposed to COVID-19, and therefore transference of those antibodies. Whether a patient with CLL who has hypogammaglobulinemia and then develops COVID-19 and becomes quite sick would benefit from added IVIG is an area of controversy. Some feel that there may be a benefit in preventing other infections, like a secondary bacterial pneumonia that could occur for a patient who has pulmonary issues and who might be receiving mechanical ventilation. And there is some data to suggest from China that intravenous immunoglobulin may also have anti-inflammatory effects and may be of value in treating patients with COVID-19. But the short answer is there's no data on a large scale to support its use. And I think, at our center, we're thinking about this on a patient-by-patient basis for our CLL patient population.
Let me just follow up with that. Are we going to be making, if we do get the infection, kind of the immune, how capable are we of making antibodies, or do we have any sense of that at this point?
I think there's no, specifically for CLL patients, I don't think we have any data in terms of what the antibody response will be, or how brisk it will be, or how long lasting it will be. Danielle, anything else you've seen?
I haven't seen anything specific for patients with CLL, other than, understandably, I think it's going to be very diverse responses just based on where patients are untreated versus you've had treatment. We need to collect that information, obviously, but I have not seen it specifically.
I'm going to bundle a bunch of questions here together and maybe start with you, Dr. LeClaire, in terms of the risk of getting it. And if you want to defer to the clinicians on some of it, that's fine too. But aerosol transmission, how risky is that we've heard sort of differing things in the news about aerosol transmission. We talked about the packaging. What about the groceries themselves? Do I have to worry about the lettuce that I'm buying or something like that, or that's being dropped off at my door because I'm no longer going to the grocery store? And then let me add the other piece, like there's different recommendations in different states and different countries. In the UK, they're recommending that we stay home for 12 weeks. So let me ask you the awkward question here. If I'm home, does my partner stay home too? Do they need to shield me? Well, what if my partner is a doctor or a nurse? Should they be going to work in a high-risk situation and coming home? And if they are, can we still be a husband and wife, or does my partner have to sleep in a different part of the house now? Or do we have to be extra careful? So I'm sorry to be bundling all these together, but there's a ton of anxiety about all of these questions. So aerosols, the food, and how long we should stay sheltered, and what about our partners or our adult children or our kids? What do we do with them? Yeah.
Like, I can give you some of the ideas that are out there, and then we'll pass it off. I think the answer is, when you look at all of the information that's out there and all of the personal experience that we all have. You go to the grocery store now, and everybody that I see who works in the grocery store has got gloves on. And none of them can go to work unless they have a normal temperature. And so there are some, I think, pretty rigid in most places, gateways that the grocery store support people are having to go through in order to be able to get to your food. Then comes the you buy it or it gets brought to your home. Depending, I think, and Dr. Matto and Brenda can argue about this afterwards and tell me I'm wrong, but what are you? At what stage are you? If the only thing that you have had with CLL is a really bad nightmare when someone told you you had this disease, and you're still in watch and worry, and the last time you had a cold was 2 years ago, you are a totally different person making totally different decisions than if you are a person who's had CLL for a number of years. You went through FCR for a while and that was okay. And then you moved to some other drug and maybe that was okay, but not wonderful. And you do have a terrible time, even with the common cold. Then those are two different answers, because they're two different worlds that those two different people live in. I think if you pay attention to the CDC and NIH, and for those of you who are out of the United States, to your state's health ministry and the World Health Organization, following their rules, as most of the grocery stores seem to be doing across the world, will probably get you by. How does this virus move around? Well, in the beginning, we had no clue. And then it was, everything. And slowly but surely, we've been cutting things down to probably this is a droplet. Whenever you talk to someone, well, stuff happens. Whenever I'm going to wash up afterwards. Whenever you do this, I'm moving stuff from my hands to my eyes. I'm maybe at this desk, maybe somebody else has been at this desk for a while and left something for me. That's probably, excuse me, the number one, and no, it's a lisinopril cough. It's not a COVID cough. Probably nothing's going to happen to me. But if I take those precautions of washing my hands, washing my face too, I'll probably be fine with groceries. That won't be a problem. And I've forgotten what the other questions were, so I will pass them off to someone else while I go get something to have for a drink.
Dr. Matter or Dr. Brander, on the aerosol transmissions, do you have any comments on that? Is that a concern for us?
Yeah, I do think that it is a concern. The one thing I wanted to add to Susan's comments is, for me, the jury is still out that it is truly two different worlds for patients with CLL. with the example being those who are treated and those who are not treated. And the reason I say that is that, you know, most of the damage done from the virus is not from the virus itself, but it's done from our body's immunological response to the virus. Meaning inflammation can be our best friend, or it can also be our worst enemy, depending on how much there is. And so in my mind, the watch and wait early stage patients need to be just as much, if not more cautious than anyone with CLL, because their immune system is still intact. And so the amount of inflammation they have may be similar to non-CLL patients. And so I have not yet made the distinction in my patients to say, watch and wait, you're safer than a patient who has therapy and is immunocompromised, because of the fact that it's not only about risk of transmission, but it's also about inflammation and the body's response.
And do you want to comment on the aerosol issue?
Danielle, do you want to?
Oh, sure. No, I agree with Anthony. I think we're trying to take a very cautious approach with patients in terms of what they expose themselves to. We obviously all have to eat. We don't want patients losing weight. We want you to eat healthy. And so we have to try to balance the understandable concerns with, we have to get food some way. And so it's either going to the store, for some people, delivery services. But again, I don't want to cause more concern that if you don't have delivery services options, that it's a problem going to the store. And all of this and the prevention pieces in general, I think just bring about what Anthony mentioned earlier, which I've seen a lot of my patients who have CLL say, I know you have to wash your hands for this long. I know how many things I contact, I mean, I really think people should take comfort in all the things you've learned over time, probably without knowing it, or it's probably become part of your daily life. And now is the time to educate others that are in your life to do the same. And where you can take a precaution, great. There's other things out from food services saying, you know, delivery services are no higher risk, but like was mentioned, maybe let it sit outside for a little bit. The one thing about grocery stores, and this gets to the aerosolized question that people are still figuring out, is they sound similar, but you'll hear things like droplet, contact, aerosolized. And some of that is how far the infection particle, or whatever you want to call the virus, travels and is at risk for causing an infection. And obviously in something that is still only a couple months of understanding, that data is changing. But the general thought is that most of the transmission is either from droplet spread when you're in close proximity with someone, because those droplets stay in the air and they can get to your mucous membrane, or maybe be inhaled. That part's kind of out. Aerosolized is a different part, because aerosolized means tiny little things all over that would take a really long time to settle out, and in fact can spread out a little more. So to protect against aerosolized, that's where you see people with the N95 mask versus droplets. Typically we think of the surgical mask to protect the person both coughing and droplets. The contact part is all the things we touch and then touch our face. I found actually these Zoom meetings are really good practice because we all touch our face so often. But the aerosolized means a specific spread that for most things is not thought that COVID is spread, this COVID is spread aerosolized, which would mean stays in the air for very long times for farther distances. Someone used the analogy when you see light coming in the room, all the dust particles, and takes a longer time to settle out. That being said, well then why do you see healthcare workers on TV or talking about needing N95? Well, the very important part is there are procedures we know, like intubation, when patients need to go on a ventilator. Even sometimes the kind of testing you're doing, where you might aerosolize the procedure. So it is really important, while the spread might not mainly be aerosolized, there are procedures or there are other situations where we think that can be a concern. And so our healthcare workers or others involved in those things are trying to get those protective devices, and why it's so important, or you might have heard that. And I think that's where some of the confusion comes. But again, we never say never. We're learning more things, but that's I think where we are in terms of the aerosolized part.
And let me ask the clinicians here the awkward question: what you're telling your patients if their partner is a healthcare provider or an essential work, they're sheltering themselves, they're doing the right thing, they're staying at home, but they're married to a doctor or a nurse or a physical therapist or somebody who's going in and seeing patients. What are you telling them in what they should do when their partner comes home, or should their partner not be going into work?
I think it's not an awkward question. It's a good question, and I don't think there's one answer to that question, because everybody lives in the real world where options are different for different people. When this event was starting today, I was mentioning that I have a family member who is a healthcare provider who's been staying with me to try to avoid as much contact at home because he's in a high risk situation. Certainly if staying somewhere else is not an option, and I don't think that that is mandated, I do think that, certainly the minute they walk in the door, they take off their clothes, they shower, they wash, more than wash their hands, but shower is very important. I think that handling those clothing items, for example, should be done by the person who's doing the work. They need to do their own laundry. I think that monitoring very closely for any symptoms whatsoever would be mandated and a requirement to separate. Whether someone needs to sleep in a separate bed or a separate room, I think that's an individual decision. I don't think that it's mandated at this time, but if you're following social distancing, then that is a component of social distancing that one should absolutely consider. But again, there's not one answer for everyone. Certainly while you're together, taking as many precautions as possible to not have exposure, I think is key. I know that's a little bit of a non-answer where I'm not giving you a definitive, yes, you need to move to a different side of the street. But for most people, that's not an option.
Let me ask this question, because Dr. Brander is going to have to leave us in a few minutes, but I want to try to get both of you to weigh in on this. There are a number of promising therapies that are out there that people are looking at, and I would love you and all the panels to weigh in on that. There's questions on, of course, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine and Zithromax and convalescent serum and monoclonal antibodies to be used. I've even heard that ibrutinib might be helpful to people who have COVID. So what general, I can't even go through all the ones that have been suggested to me, and I know there's a frenzy of research. What are you telling your patients to do in these circumstances, and what's your sense of these?
Well, I think, Brian, what you said, promising, means that all over the globe now we're very connected of what people are hypothesizing that could work well, and maybe starting to see in individual patients that have the COVID-19 disease some promising results. But the key here being promising, and that these are being hopefully looked at as much as possible if there's a trial available, or at least with the doctor and treating team at hand with a patient with the disease. That's very different than saying wide scale that these should be used for prevention. I think the general caveat of sometimes the things we don't know can really hurt us, and so we hear the promise, but maybe as Tom can chime in here, is when we start a new medication, we have to consider interactions with other drugs. We have to consider your cardiac history. Does it do something called prolong the recovery time of the heart? So like you said, we can't get through all of them. I do think a lot of us are encouraged that people are starting to look at different things, would not recommend them as prevention and trying to get them through other methods, and just that might end up doing more harm than good, especially when being considered before patients have an infection or the disease.
Anybody else want to add to that?
So I would just add that, we know for a fact that there is a drug interaction between idelalisib and chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. And so I think that if anybody is going to be in a situation where they might receive one of those drugs, it's critical that their CLL doctor be part of that decision-making process so that we can avoid that. So, it's not likely that you're going to go to your CLL doc if you start to have the symptoms of COVID. So I think that whoever is treating you needs to be in consultation with your CLL doctor.
And while I've got here, Tom, questions about vitamins and supplements, specifically vitamin C, vitamin D. People are asking, would that be helpful? Any comment on that?
So we know that there's a correlation with vitamin D levels and better outcomes in CLL. But I caution patients to not use supplements on their own, to work with their team. As a CLL patient myself, when I started care, I was under Dr. Brander's care. Her clinical pharmacist actually took a list of all my medications and supplements. And here I am, a pharmacist, and I didn't know that fish oil capsules also have anticoagulant effect, just like the ibrutinib does. So there's, pharmacists and other healthcare providers that are familiar with CLL will know that that's a problem, but the general practice pharmacist that's working at CVS may not be aware of that interaction. So I think it's really critical. Again, I keep saying, take advantage of that CLL team that works with your doctor.
Anybody else want to add to that?
The one thing I wanted to say is that if there's any positive to come out of this whole terrible crisis, is it's very nice to see the barriers are coming down so quickly for clinical research, and that I'm witnessing a speed of the development of protocols, the approval of those protocols, and the implementation of them in health systems around our area faster than I've ever seen before for any topic. I think it's something we should remember after this crisis is over, is how quickly clinical research can happen for other topics related, for example, CLL.
Yeah.
I'm going to thank Dr. Brander for her time, and she's got a hard stop on the hour. So I'm very grateful for you coming in, but the other panelists have agreed to stay on for maybe another 10 or 15 minutes. So I know that some of the audience may have to sign off, but we're not going to get through the 150 questions that we have, but I did want to keep going with a couple more questions. And thank you very much, Dr. Brander.
Thank you. And again, a lot patients can control, so thanks for bringing light to that. So thanks for you.
I have a clinical question for you, Dr. Mato. When does a CLL patient know if their virus has reached their infection has reached the point where they should maybe not be taking care of this at home? They should come to the hospital. I have a personal friend who's a physician in France who's tested positive for COVID-19, and he's monitoring himself at home because he's a physician. So he's doing his pulse, heart rate, temp, all of this stuff, and working with his own clinician. But most patients aren't going to have that level of sophistication. What are you saying to your patients about now it's time to get checked by a physician, you're having these symptoms, or just stay hunkered down and you can wait this out?
Yeah, it's a good question, especially because we're learning a lot more about the clinical course of this viral infection. And there are some patients who can be relatively stable and then progress to a situation that is potentially life-threatening in a short period of time. The general symptoms that we're seeing associated with the viral infection is, of course, fever, cough, myalgias, shortness of breath are some of the things that are happening commonly, in addition to having a sore throat. I think patients with CLL have been sick enough in the past to know when it's something beyond what they can handle at home. But certainly if there's any respiratory issues, shortness of breath, quickening of the breathing, any sort of issue that may indicate that you're not able to breathe well on your own, I think is a mandate for presentation. Whether a fever and a cough alone would warrant a hospitalization, on many levels, I think probably not. But this is this is the point where being a patient that's a little bit different than the general population really matters in keeping the oncologist in the loop in terms of helping to make that decision. At our center, we have an entire COVID team that evaluate patients who are positive with their symptoms and help manage them over the first several days of the infection, either in the hospital or remotely, to try to decide when that patient needs to be brought in for more emergent care. For the patients that we have positive, we're in very close contact with them quite frequently to try to make that decision in terms of when to pull the trigger to bring them in for closer monitoring. So I think involving the oncologist, knowing your body, assessing for symptoms that involve breathing, for example, being most importantly, even if you're conservative and you're assessed and sent back home again, I think are very important for this patient population.
Here's a question for Tom and and maybe Dr. Mado too. Right now you can get medications off label. That's completely fine. Let's say we get some good data or we find an experimental drug that works for this. How quickly can these things be moved? Tell us a little bit about the approval process to now that it is on label. Tell us a little bit about an uptick in manufacturing, because we're seeing shortages of drugs that are just on a whisper are suddenly gone from the shelves.
Sure. Well, I think that, it will depend on what that solution potentially is and whether or not there is commercial supply of that product at the moment. So when we talk about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, we have that's available for other indications, rheumatoid arthritis, malaria treatment. So those products are being made on a regular basis. Maybe made, on a periodic basis at a manufacturing plant where they cycle through and they, for 3 days they're making chloroquine, and then the rest of the month they're making some other products on those machines after they've been cleaned. And so that production can be shifted to be kind of a more constant. They can also add shifts, and move to from an 8-hour shift to a 12-hour shift. So there is some resiliency. Where you tend to run into a problem is when there's only one supplier of a medication. And that's a big cause of why a lot of the other drug shortages that we've had, over the last several years occur is that we've gotten to the point where many of our drugs today come from only a single supplier. And where we had the luxury in the past of 5 or 6 different manufacturers preparing and producing those drugs, now they're often down to 1 or 2. And that has to do with the economics of the manufacturer of those drugs. So I don't think there's a single answer as to the supply availability of that. But again, under the act that the president has signed where, manufacturers can be directed to make certain products, I don't think it's unreasonable that that could be one of the provisions where drug manufacturers that already make oral tablets would be asked to produce those products. So I think from a supply chain standpoint, we could ramp that up. There have been some anecdotal stories about people going out and having access to these drugs and taking them to just have them on hand in case they think that they've been exposed, or to potentially take it prophylactically. I think that, again, as we saw with masks, we see these potentially life-saving therapies in the hands of the wrong people at times.
I agree with that comment. I think that the worst thing anybody out there could do is try to manage this medically themselves from an intervention perspective, regardless of what you have access to. Prophylaxis makes no sense at this point. And many of these medications have real side effects and real interactions. From a development perspective, I do see signs from the government, FDA, that they have tremendously ramped up their ability to to evaluate proposals that are promising from a research perspective. I can speak from my own personal experience, they have a team for COVID-19 research, and having worked with a colleague who inquired about a trial that they were designing, they sent it on a weekend evening and got an answer back the same evening. So things are, from a drug development perspective, really accelerated in terms of how these protocols are being evaluated, whether they're of merit or not, and answers are being given very quickly from government regulatory agencies and from institutions. This one particular protocol I was referring to from a colleague was submitted to their institution and was evaluated next day. So this is a rapid change in terms of clinical research and drug development.
And Dr. Mato, just to push, because some people have asked, there are still trials that are open. You're still actively enrolling patients in trials, but it's on a case-by-case basis, at least at your institution. Is that right?
CLL?
Yes.
Absolutely. If we think that the trial drug is the best answer for the patient, then that's the best answer for the patient. And so we are evaluating every patient's need for therapy. And if the trial is the answer, then at least in the current situation as of today, we would have the resources to treat that patient.
Dr. LeClaire, a couple questions on false positives and false negatives in the testing.
Those are issues that we all have to deal with. And I think this is going to help explain why people can't get testing. Supposing for the moment, because you're in a village of 3,500 people, one of you is sick. So the incidence of whatever disease we're talking about is 1 in 3,500. The clinical laboratory has a test in which it is absolutely accurate 999 times. So if I test every single person in that 3,500 person town, I will have one person who gets a true positive, and I will get 3 people who will get a false positive. Well, how do I change these numbers to make the answer that we give to Dr. Matta or any of the other physicians more substantial? If the only people that we test are people who have signs and symptoms that appear to be consistent with this disease, then I'm not testing 1 out of 3,500 people randomly. I'm testing a bunch of people now who probably have a much higher incidence of this disease, and maybe I go down to maybe an incidence of 10 out of 350 people, or something like that, that's a closer, higher number, so that I can say that these tests are accurate to within the margin of our ability to give you an answer. So are there false positives? Yes. Are there false negatives to the same numbers? Yes. Are there issues? Let us say that yesterday, I always use myself as a poor example, that yesterday I got COVID-19. It landed in my upper respiratory tract. There's a little bit of it. I don't even have any symptoms. If you tested me today, I would be negative, even though I carry a very small amount of this virus. So in order to prove that I don't carry it, you would also have to test me tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after. And all of a sudden, this becomes uncontrollable. There's no possible way that we can give anybody the test results that they want. So when you hear people say, well, you know, I have a cough and they wouldn't test me, we may not be able to test you because we can't bring you out of this random population yet and put you into a population where our statistics are going to make this answer real. Because the last thing that any physician wants to hear is, well, it's negative today, but I don't know about tomorrow. They want to be able to get an answer and say, I can act on this. Does that help a little with false positives, negatives?
I think so.
Okay.
Dr. Mado, you want to add anything, or Tom?
No, I think that was a good explanation. And I don't have anything to add to that.
So
I agree.
I have a ton more questions, but we're already over time, but I wanted to give the panelists a chance if they wanted to say any final thoughts or recommendations. And maybe one of the pressing things that we didn't get to is you could just touch on in your final thoughts is, what are you advising patients about the anxiety that they're feeling? Because that's come across in a lot of the questions. So maybe we can start with you, Tom, and just if there's anything you want to say and wrap up, and then Susan, I'll give you, Dr. Mado, the last word. Then we'll do our final poll. So please stay aboard for that final poll question, and we will announce the timing and details on. We're going to do the same time, same place next week with the same panel, and we'll also have Dr. Pagel out of Seattle, kind of one of the other epicenters. We've got Seattle and New York, the big epicenters of this, and Dr. Pagel will be on next week. So Tom, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think that, being a member of several online CLL groups, support groups, there has been a lot of anxiety about product availability. I hope that, through this presentation today and as information becomes available, you'll notice on my slide that I had a link to the FDA drug shortage list. If anybody wants to follow that, that's perfectly fine. I would also caution that, with almost all of the CLL drug treatments that we have available to us, we do have clinical alternatives. So when we talk about drugs like the BTK inhibitors, we only had ibrutinib for many years, but now we have a acalabrutinib. So, I think that if we got into a shortage situation, that clinicians would probably, easily make that transition from one of the BTKs to another. And so there are options out there. And I think that, the media is not really picking up a lot of the information about the fact that, cargo is still coming into the country by boat and by plane, and that, priority is being given to bringing in medical supplies and drugs over, little chachi dolls from China and things like that. So, we'll, continue to monitor this. And if we see any changes, we'll obviously post it on the CLL Society webpage and make, our patients aware of any potential shortages.
Thank you, Tom. Dr. LeClaire?
Well, I think the biggest issue, excuse me, is the anxiety issue. And I've kind of boiled my life down to four rules. The first one is, if I want to know about the science, I'm going to listen to CDC, NIH, and the World Health Organization, and that's pretty much it. And I'm not going to listen to the news because most of the time they have conflicting information. I'm going to go to those sites to find science information. If I want civic information, I want to listen to the governor or the mayor of my town because they're the ones who are in charge of closures and regulations and who can go where, when. And if I want anything about me, I talk to my healthcare team because they're the only ones who know me sometimes better than I know me in a way. And the fourth and probably the most important one in many ways is, and I'm still in charge. I make the decisions. I control my life. I'm the one who decides I am going to go to the grocery store today or I'm not. I'm the one who says, oh, I don't need to wash my hands right now, or says, I must wash my hands right now. Anxiety often goes along with a sense of no control. Take the control back. It is your life. Listen to the people who know the best and try and filter out all of the other noise, because that's what it is, noise. Okay.
That's
2 minutes
super.
over.
That's really, I like that a lot, Susan. Thanks so much.
I like that a lot too. I think we should maybe just end with your comment now. What I wanted to say is one of the things that's important to remember about being a patient with CLL, and this is in many ways different than other cancer types or groups of patients with cancer, is that there really is a close-knit community. And I think Brian has been probably the biggest advocate of having the message in place that there's such a thing as a CLL team. So while I'm sitting here for the last hour and 17 minutes, there's a nurse who's answering questions. There's a nurse practitioner who's seeing patients. There's an office coordinator who's looking through my schedule and moving those visits to telemedicine. There's a whole team who's involved in taking care of you. Access that at different levels and try to make sure that you keep us in the loop as to what's going on. No symptom is too small to be evaluated. It could be the earliest evidence of this infection, and we want to be in the loop on everything related to this crisis. And then also keep in mind, from an anxiety perspective, it's real. And so try to find an appropriate person or outlet to constructively vent those frustrations or those concerns. Keep in mind, this is a great time to join patient support groups, even if they're just virtual. There's a whole community of people out there who can also share their experiences. And I know the CLL Society has been very active and passionate in setting up those groups. So reach out to Brian, reach out to the team, and make sure that you get plugged into an appropriate patient support group to try to address those concerns.
I want to thank our faculty who've been amazing. If I could add one advice, I always tell my patients, don't get anxious about being anxious. Accept that this is an anxiety time. Just live with your anxiety. It's okay to be anxious right now. It would be crazy not to be anxious right now with what's going on. Just accept that's where you're at. That's kind of the Zen state. Yes, I'm anxious, but don't get anxious about being anxious, not meta anxious, like I call it. Yeah, I'm very grateful to our faculty. We're switching all our support groups to virtual. So if you go to the website, we'll have the options. We're trying to keep them local. So if even though they're virtual, but if you're in the New York area, you would go to the New York support group, but you can just zoom in like we did for this. And we're putting those platforms together and really increasing our capacity for that. We're going to have the same meeting, same time, same place next week with the same faculty. And we're going to start, I'm going to thank everyone for attending this. Here's some of the details. And I think we're going to do our test questions here. So real movement here. So I think we made a difference. I think here when we started, that was 41% that strongly agreed, and that moved up to 70%. About the testing, I think again, we moved from 21% to 52%. So I think that's significant. The concern about the medications, I hear I'm concerned about the medicine. So that dropped from 13% to 3%. So I think that's, Tom's reassurance, I think, was helpful. And let's just take a look here and see if there's a difference in what people were going to do. And I think here it's relatively similar. 44% were going to stay at home and let the family shop for them. That at the first time, now it's 54. The other numbers have changed a little bit. 24 would stay at home except for shopping. Now that's 31%. And so those numbers didn't change that much. So this will be archived. The slides will be available to you. We have another meeting next week. Please tell your friends if we didn't get to your questions. We will try to answer those online, though we may not answer all, several hundred questions we got, but we'll do our best to do that. And again, thank you, everybody. And please excuse us for running over here, and stay home, stay safe, and keep a broader perspective. This too will pass, and I look forward to checking in with everybody next week. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.